All right, the fun part starts now. Before we write any code from our 3D Adidas, let's get our project structure organized. So let's start with the public folder. In here, I'm going to remove everything, and then I'm going to add my own. And here we go. You can actually get all of these assets from my GitHub repository, which I actually put the link down in the description. So as you can see in public folder, we have icons. And then we have models that contains folders. And each folder represents a single page. For example, in gray folder, we have graystudio.glb. And sport, we have sportstudio.glb. And white, we have whitestudio.glb. And the main one is mainstudio.glb, which we're gonna use it in our main menu. And after that, we have the test, which you already know what is the test is. And then we have the textures folder, which contains, again, some folders, and each folder represents a single page. For example, in main folder, we have these textures. And finally, we have the MP3 file. And after that, let's modify the app folder. So in here, I'm gonna get rid of this favorite icon here, and let's add this favorite icon. And in global.cs, I'm gonna remove these two, and then I'm gonna keep the background. And let's change the background color to 000. And for body, I'm going to keep this body. And let's remove all of this. There we go. And let's add a Tailwind utility class by saying @utility hover-animation. And let's say @apply cursor-pointer. Let's make the opacity -75. And while user hover over it, make the opacity to 100. And let's add the transition -opacity with duration of 100. There we go. Now let's head to the layout.tsx. Now in here, we are not going to use this fonts. So let's remove that. So in here, we're going to use Molish font, which is actually similar to the Adidas font. After that, in here, I'm going to say const Molish is equals to Molish. I'm going to define a subset of Cyrillic. There we go. Now let's add the smallish in here by saying smallish.className. Beautiful. And after that, let's change the metadata to Adidas. And let's change the description to Foot Locker and Adidas Originals. Latest collection breaks new grounds. And right now we are ready to add the main menu one. So in order to create the main menu, let's navigate to the components folder. And in here, I'm going to create a new file and I'm going to call it main studio model.tsx. Now in here, we need to convert this main studio.glb into JSX. So let's open up that website again. And I'm just gonna simply navigate to this file and drag that file in here. Now, as you can see, our model has been loaded. Now let's change the directory of the file. The file is located in public models main. So let's do that. And here, just saying models main. There we go. Now I'm just gonna copy all of this and paste that right over here. Let's do some cleanups. So I'm just gonna get rid of the props and the properties here and the materials, because I actually exported this model without using any materials. So let's get rid of this. Just get rid of this material. Here we go. All right, now since we are using TypeScript, we need to define these nodes. So just like before, I'm just gonna simply head to the cube.tsx and copy this GLTF result. And let's paste that right over here. Now we need to define this 3.mesh by saying import star as 3 from 3. All right, now we need to cast that use GLTF by saying as unknown as GLTF result. All right, now let's head back to this other tab. And then what I'm gonna do is, since we're gonna use our own textures, we don't need to cast shadows and receive shadows, because later on we're going to use mesh basic materials. So let's remove those by pressing Ctrl D and remove that. There we go. All right, now we need to import this mesh into a canvas. So let's create one for that. Inside a components folder, let's create a new file. I'm going to call it viewcanvas.tsx. And in here, I'm going to run refce, and let's remove the import React from React, and let's replace this div with a canvas from React 3 Fiber. Now let's define a style for this. Style equals to position fixed, and let's set the inset to 0, and let's say overflow hidden. All right. Now within the canvas, we need to import that main studio model by adding a main studio model. All right, as you can see, it is not working. I think I forgot to change this function name. Yes, I'm going to make that model. There we go. All right, now let's import that here. Okay. All right, now we got to add the use client since we are using canvas here. Got to add use client. We're saying use client. And then we need to add this component into our homepage in order to see the result. So in here, I'm going to replace this with view canvas from @components view canvas. All right, here we go. Now we have our model right over here. In order to drag it around, I'm going to add orbit control from React 3.js. Beautiful. All right, now we need to add some sort of textures to our model. So let's head back to the main studio model. So right below this use GLTF, I'm going to create a const textures equals to use textures. And then in here, we need to import the texture path. So where is the texture path? The textures path is right over here. In the public textures main, you can see we need to use all of these textures. So let's write each and every single path and import that right over here. So I'm just going to simply copy all of the textures path. And in here, I'm going to say const main is equals to this path. All right, now we need to import this path as an object into use texture hook. You can see that you also import this array or record of string. So right now we are actually using a record of string. So I'm going to say simply main. In order to use the texture, we need to add mesh basic material. So for each and every single one of them, we need to create a material by saying materials is equals to new 3.mesh basic material. And then it'll take an object of map equals to textures dot default studio. Now, as you can see, the texture is actually flipped and the color is actually a wrong color. So we need to modify that texture. So in here, I'm going to say textures dot default studio dot flip y is equals to false. And after that, let's duplicate that. And this time we're going to take color space is equals to 3.srgb color space. Now let's refresh that again. There we go. Now let's actually make the visibility of this box hidden so that we can see the shirts. So I'm going to say visible is equals to false. There we go. Now let's also define textures for the shirts as well. So I'm going to copy this material and paste that out over here. Now this time we're going to use dot. So we are in a shirt white, use white shirt. As you can see, the texture is flipped and the color spacing is actually wrong. So let's actually define that again. So I'm just going to go ahead and duplicate this again. And this time, instead of saying default studio, I'm going to say white shirt. Let's refresh that again. As you can see, it is correct. And again, we need to duplicate this. And again, we need to copy this and duplicate this right over here and so on. All right, now can you see the issue we are creating here? We are actually duplicating our logic. As you can see, the mesh studio model component shouldn't be responsible for fetching the path from the public folder and creating these textures. This is a clear separation of concern problem. So we need to move this textures loading logic out of this component to make it more reusable and clean. So let's refactor that right now. So let's create a new folder at the root level and call it leap. And within the leap, let's create a new file and let's call it textures.ts. All right, now this file is responsible to centralize our texture path. So in here, I'm going to say export const studio textures is equals to an object. And I'm just going to simply copy all of the texture path And then here I'm going to define a main, which is an object with these texture path. And the next thing that we got to do is to create a texture factory. So instead of creating our textures here and do the modification on that, we're going to put that responsibility to another file. So inside the lead folder, I'm going to go ahead and create a use textures.ts. Now remember that I actually named this file plural, not singular. And in this file, let's define a function by saying export const use main studio textures equals to function. And then after that, we're going to say const textures is equals to use texture hook from React 3.js. And then we're going to import those textures path by saying studio textures dot main. Now, as you can see, we have all of those textures as an object. In order to modify the colors and flips, we need to iterate through this object. If you want to iterate through the object, we're going to say object.values textures, and then we're going to simply for each through the object, and then we're going to take a single texture, and then we're going to say text.flipy equals to false, and text.colorspace is equals to 3. Let's import that 3. Import star as 3 from 3. So let's say 3.srgb color space. And then we need to return that texture. Let's say return that texture, please. Now let's head back to the main studio model. Now in here, I'm going to remove all of these. And then I'm just going to simply say const textures is equals to use main studio textures. Simple enough. Now you can see we have all of those textures right over here. But right now, we need to create the mesh basic material for each and every single one of them. We're going to create another factory for materials. So inside a lib folder, I'll create a new file. I'm going to call it material.ts. So in here, I'm going to create a function of create materials. So it is definitely going to take a textures. If you're wondering what is the type of these textures, you can simply go to the main studio model and hover over this texture. You can see that these textures will return an object with key of string and the value of 3.texture. So let's create that. So it is returning a record, which represents as an object of string with the value of 3. So let's import that 3, import star as 3 from 3 again. And then we're going to say 3.texture. There we go. And let's create that body. All right, now we need to iterate through the textures. This time I'm going to use for loop. So in here, I'm going to say for const, I'm going to say key and texture of object.entries, because I want to get the keys and the values together. So in here, I'm going to import that textures, and then let's say, please new that 3.mesh basic material. And then for the property, I'm going to say map is equals to texture. So in order to use this, we need to store them in an object. So in here, I'm going to create a variable by saying const mats, let's say record, and the keys are string and its values are 3.mesh basic material equals to an empty object. After that, I'm going to say mats with this key is equals to this. And finally, we're going to return that material. All right, now let's use this create materials in main studio model. So right over here, I'm going to say create material, which is going to take a textures. And then we have const mats is equals to this. Now we have all of these basic materials right over here. All right, now let's remove this new 3-mesh basic material right over here and use that mats. Mats dot. Now you can see it is not actually strongly typed because it is returning an object of string with the value of 3-mesh basic material. So basically it doesn't know we have default studio, white studio, red studio, and so on. So this could be an error prone. We could actually say default studio. But what if you actually missed up one of the letters? For example, I'm going to remove the T of this and refresh that. You're going to see the textures has gone. So we need to make this strongly typed. Since this create materials is returning an object, so we can cast that by saying as record. So what is the key? The keys are right here. If I head to the textures, the keys are studio textures.main. I'm going to say key of type of studio textures.main. And the values are 3.mesh basic material. All right, now as you can see in here, everything is identified properly. So right now it is actually giving me an error, which is saying that I don't know this default studio, and it is right. So we can say default.studio, and for the other one, mats.white-shirt, beautiful. And the other one, let's define a material. It is a sport shirt by saying mats.sportshirt, nice. And the material again is equals to mats.grayshirt, beautiful. And there we have it. Look at how cleaner and more maintainable our main studio model component is now. Let's quickly recap what we just achieved. So one was separation of concern. We moved all our texture path into a dedicated textures.ts, creating a single source of truth. We extracted the textures loading and material creation into custom hooks and functions like this. This means if we need to change how a material is made, we only do it in one place. For example, I'm going to make this true in order to make everything flipped up. Now it is actually working. Now let's turn back to the false. Now our main component is now purely focused on what it should be, structuring the scene and assigning geometries and materials. It's instantly more readable and easier to reason about. This refactor might seem like a small change, but it is a huge win for scalability. Adding a new texture variant or updating a material's property is now incredibly simple and won't break anything else.